Good evening, and here we are again at the Monastery of All Saints of North America, and tonight we're going to resume our discussions about the Old Testament is about you, and perhaps a second broadcast to answer a few questions that have arisen. The book of Genesis, which we completed, begins with in the beginning God created and ends in a coffin in Egypt. The book of Exodus begins by telling us that all of Joseph's brethren and family were in Egypt, and Joseph died, and his brethren and all their generation. And there arose a Pharaoh who did not know Joseph or his people, but the children of Israel, of Jacob, had grown and become very strong and mighty. We might ask, first of all, why, after the famine was over, remember it was the famine that brought Jacob and his family down into Egypt in the first place. Why, when that was over, did the descendants of Jacob not return to the promised land, which had been given them? They knew the covenant with Abraham, they knew the tradition. They would know when Moses came and say, "The living one has sent me," they would know that tradition also. Remember that after Abraham died, Isaac went up and dwelt by the wellspring of the living one who sees me. And Moses would identify the one who sent him also as the living one. After the famine had come to an end, and Jacob's children could have returned to that promised land, they did not. It was far too comfortable in the district of Goshen in northern Egypt. They had put down roots, they had some kind of farming, they had their herds, they had some craftsmanship, whatever they did. Life was good there. But it was not what the covenant with Abraham had stated. The children of Jacob did not want to go back because it was better for them physically, materially, where they were. And so, in a way, they had put aside God's promise, the covenant land, the promised land, for the sake of the comforts that they found, in a way for the sake of certain passions. And perhaps this is the part of the story that we seldom think about. The children of Israel became in bondage to the comforts and the ease of life in which they at that time lived, and then put aside the obligation, the duty, the covenant they had with God, that particular relationship that was tied to the land itself in which they were called to dwell. And they did not return. This is often a problem for us, in that we choose ease and comfort over obligations and duties, and even over our life in Christ. Very often we will move someplace far removed from a church, where we cannot have the fellowship of other Orthodox Christians, nor can we even have Holy Communion or easily baptize our children, because we find some kind of comfort or ease or economic advantage in some other place where these things are not available. And we make a conscious choice to be away from our life in Christ, to be away from the church, to be away from the community, the fellowship of the faithful, to be away from the liturgy and Holy Communion for the sake of these things. Occasionally, of course, it's actually necessary for survival, but certainly not always. And Israel, the children of Israel, the sons of Jacob, had to make a choice. In this case, the sons themselves chose after the famine had ended. The famine lasted for 7 years. And after that, they could have returned to their home, to that promised land, to that covenant that God had made with Abraham, but chose instead to come into a kind of bondage to the comfort and ease of life where they were. And then, of course, they were to come into yet a greater bondage. First of all, Pharaoh commanded that the midwives put to death the male children that were born of Israel, because they were becoming so powerful and so strong that they would eventually challenge the local population, and perhaps even challenge the imperial government of Pharaoh. Now, a little bit later, I'm going to give you some history of this particular event, because we do know which Pharaoh it was who actually issued an edict that the male children of the Asiatics, as they were called by the Egyptians, should be put to death to prevent this continued growth and development of the people. So long as the female children were left alive, they could intermarry with Egyptians. But the male children could form a warrior class, and then they could challenge the Egyptians in their own land. So because they chose not to return to the land given to Abraham and his descendants, because they chose not to go back to the promised land, to the land of the covenant, and fulfill their covenant with God, they would become slaves in that land in which they lived. Slaves first to the passions and the self-considerations, slaves to their own refusal to fulfill the obligations of the covenant and to claim that land which was given to Abraham. And then slaves indeed, because the Egyptians, of course, as you know the story, would turn them into slaves. And we have to see this in our own spiritual lives as well, that we might come into bondage to certain of our passions, to comforts, consolations of life, the ease of life. And in short order, because of the lack of real challenges in life, a person can drop their obligations and their responsibilities to God, abandon the community of the faithful, or at least not really participate with them. And then we find all manner of excuses for not appearing for the divine liturgy, not preparing ourselves for Holy Communion, and not maintaining the fast of the church and this life that is so necessary to us in order to maintain our spiritual perspective. You see, without coming together with the congregation of the people of God, without being present for the divine liturgy, and without keeping the fasts and the feast of the church, our perspective really does become skewed. And we come into a kind of bondage which seems on the surface like freedom, and we begin to lose our covenant with God. That is, that calling to a life in Christ, that concept of salvation, of redemption, and that calling for fellowship with Orthodox Christians in the act of worship. And we come into that bondage, and the bondage becomes deeper and deeper. People who have given up a great deal to go someplace where they could earn more money or have a better life, a better kind of work and things. For instance, the people who flooded to Fort McMurray in northern Alberta to take advantage of the boom. Now, of course, the boom has collapsed. And what has happened is that so many of the people who went there thought that life was always going to be good. This is the land of Goshen in Egypt for us. Very rich land, agriculture, places to feed the sheep. Well, of course, in Fort McMurray,